All right, Second Kings chapter 4 has a beginning and the end, which we looked at last time, dealt with how God provided for those who were in poverty in different situations. And I separated it from, it was just too long of a chapter, but separated it from how God helps those who had money. Okay.
Yeah.
So not all trials that we have are financial. If you've had financial trials, those probably stick in your mind. And we mentioned last week, some times of life that usually almost everybody doesn't have resources. Typically, when you're young, college, after college, uh, newly married, young children.
Yeah.
But so you may have, and in our country, compared to the rest of the world, most of us are in the very top percentage of those who have means. If you have a car, you're probably the top 10%, just guessing. And if you have multiple cars or you've got indoor plumbing and air conditioning, and we've got a lot of wealth in our country, and you may not be wealthy compared to people in our country, but compared to others in many, many parts of the world, we do have a lot. Okay. So just because we have more wealth in our country doesn't mean that you don't have trials. And there are people in our country that have trials similar to what we'll see today in Second Kings chapter 4, verses 8. So 8 to 13 is one story. 8 to 17 is one story, but the longer story is 18 to 37. Okay, so it's the same people, and so that's why I put them together. But we see in verse 8 that it is clearly a wealthy woman. Okay. She had means, and so Elisha goes to her. Shunem, you may have heard of the Shunammite, where David had a Shulamite, sorry. Shunammite, I think, is the story of a Song of Solomon. And so that is a city that's not too far from the Sea of Galilee and south of the Sea of Galilee and not too far from Nazareth. So a town of Shunem, you can find it on a map if you look at Old Testament maps. So all children are miracles. If you remember the birth of your children, where they allow fathers into the delivery room, the 4 days that I will never forget. One, I had to be woken up because my wife was almost ready to give birth in the early hours of the morning for one of my kids. And so I was glad I was awake for that. That was worth waking up for. So all children are miracles as they grow in the womb, as they enter the world. But you and I know there are a lot of people who are or were given the label miracle babies or a miraculous birth. They were not expected to survive pregnancy, birth, or early childhood. Many parents are told they could never have children. And we know of a lot of people like that. So, and in scripture, we'll see a lot of people that are given the label barren. Think of Zachariah and Elizabeth that I mentioned Sunday, that they couldn't have children. We know of Sarah and Abraham. We also know of Isaac and Rebekah, who are 20 years married before they had their twins. Hannah, Samuel's mom, and there's many others that are mentioned. So this Shunammite is in that group of ladies that I'm assuming she's of childbearing age, and her husband may be a little older than her, which was common. It says that he was older, but for whatever reason, she doesn't have children. And it's almost like the guy who was healed by Jesus in John 9. Why did God allow this to happen? So that God would receive glory. Um, and so why does this, and God receives glory in this story, but it doesn't seem logical. Okay. And so when God is not logical, there's questions that Elisha and the woman ask that we would also have the same kind of questions, like almost blaming God for doing what's wrong. Okay. Kind of like the lament Psalms. Okay. And so there are times that we feel like God's doing what's wrong, but his ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And so when bad things happen, tragedy happens, or on the front end, and people can't have children and want children, God is behind it. We know He is. for whatever reason, and we don't know on this earth why he has people that want children not to be able to have children. Okay. And so, verse 8, one day Elisha is on his way to Shunem, where there's a wealthy woman who urged him to eat some food. All right. So, food was part of poverty at the end of our story in 2 Kings 4. There was food that had to be created, multiplied, other food that had to be safe to eat with some flour. But this lady, because she's wealthy, is not going to lack food, and she has extra food because she's wealthy. And so she urges him to eat some food. Hey, stop in here and eat some food. Verse 8 continues. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat food. It's interesting. Twice it mentions food. Okay, verse 9. And she said to her husband, Behold, now I know that this is a holy man of God who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there. So they do an addition on their house just for Elisha, and it sounds like his servant Gehazi, mentioned by name, are gonna whenever he passes, he can stop there for rest. It's not going to cost them any money, like staying at somewhere else and providing food for him. So we said last time how we could determine who are the God-fearers in this time in Israel's history. Anyone who's going to care for or provide for God's servants are likely God-fearers. Remember how Obadiah was a God-fearing man and protected the prophets, where Ahab and Jezebel are trying to eliminate the prophets. Anyone who provides for God's servants are likely they're doing that because they fear God. Okay. This woman, we're not told, her husband is kind of in the background and he doesn't really say too much, so we're not sure about him, but she seems to be in the foreground. She is the person who is interacting with Elisha. She's the one who goes. She's also mentioned in a couple chapters. We'll see her again. So God fears provide for God's servants. Now, this doesn't seem like a miracle, but God works in providential ways to provide during famines. You know that with Elijah, how God used ravens and then he used a widow and just kept providing for Elijah. Here, during this famine, during this time of poverty, uh, he just happens to bring Elisha and this woman and then realize she's a God-fearer. She offers some food, and then she talks to her husband about making a room so that they can provide more than just food for Elisha as he travels. And he goes here often, so they're good friends. Verse 9. So we're going to he's a holy man of God who's continually passing our way, and let us make a room. So they make a room that he can stay in, kind of like a hotel room. Verse 11. One day he came there. He turned into that chamber and rested there, and he said to Gehazi, his servant, so it's just probably him and Gehazi talking, call this Shunammite. And when he had called her, she stood before him, and he said to him, say now to her, see, you have taken all this trouble for us. What is to be done for you? Would you have a word spoken to you on behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? So Elisha, remember, this story happens after Elisha is definitely the man of God that the kings of Israel, Judah, and Edom know that he's the man of God. So he has access to the king in a way that we don't have access to the president. Elisha is connected to the king in previous chapter. And so he says, okay, I have the king's ear. I can even get a hold of the commander of the army. Is there anything that you would like, any favor for all the kindness you've done? And she answered, verse 13, I dwell among my own people. That's a way of saying, I have all that I need. I got people around me. It's kind of like whenever you have a need and there's church around you, like I don't know what I do without my church, because anytime I have a need, my church family is there to help me, like a big family. That's right. And that's kind of where she's at. She's got family around her. She's got money. She has what she needs. She's content. Verse 14. And he said, what then? And so this is just Gehazi and Elisha talking. What then is to be done for her? Well, how can what does she need that we can be a blessing to her? Gehazi answered, well, she has no son and her husband is old. So if her husband passes away, who's going to provide for her? And so the light bulb goes off. Elisha says, "Okay, that's it. Call her." And when he had called her, she stands in the doorway and he says, "Okay, at this season, about this time next year," it sounds like Abraham and Sarah where the angel's talking to them. "About this time next year, you shall embrace a son." And she said, "No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant. Like, don't joke around." Okay. She likely had tried and tried and tried, could not have children, and gave up hope that they would ever have kids. And uh, when God promised this, this was obviously going to be a miraculous providence. So the connecting of the two is the providence of God. Providing a birth is a miracle. One of the greatest miracles is physical birth. Verse 17 says, but the woman um, conceived, and she bore a son about that time the following spring, as Elisha had said to her. So as we read through the stories of Elisha, as Elisha had said, or as according to the word of the Lord through Elisha, God is using this man to provide for people who fear him around them. So this is one of the greatest miracles of physical birth. But the bulk of this story is verses 18. That was only 10 verses. Now we have 20 verses about this son. Okay. So he's leading toward something in whoever writes this story for us to read, that there is something more miraculous that's about ready to happen. And when the child had grown, verse 18, he went out one day to his father among the reapers. So he may be old enough to help, but maybe not old enough to be hired. Um, and he says to his father, "Oh, my head, my head." Now, we don't know if this is an injury or it was something like a brain aneurysm. Something happened with his head that caused him great pain. Whatever it is, doctors likely couldn't help him, and so the father said to the servant, "Carry him to his mother." And when he lifted him and brought him to his mother, the child sat on her lap till noon. That was the morning, till noon, and then he died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. All right. This story is going to sound so similar to 1 Kings 17, although then it was a widow with a son. When that widow's son dies, she sends his son and puts him on Elijah's bed. Now, this lady has this room, and she said, "All right, there's a great tragedy. The son passes away. Um, and it was a miracle son, it was a promised son. So similar like Isaac, where God promised Abraham and Sarah a son, and then God says to sacrifice him, and it didn't make sense to Abraham at first. Why are you taking him away whenever he was a miracle son in the first place? Just to kill him? It doesn't make sense. And this is kind of what this mother's feeling. Like, don't deceive me that I'm gonna have I can have a child because I haven't been able to have a child. Now that I have a child, let's say he's 10 years old, now he dies. Like, why did God give me a son just to take his life? Okay. So then that's kind of what she's in distress and she's having these thoughts. She is a God-fearing woman though. And so she is focused on getting to Elisha. Then she calls her husband. This all happens in one day, verse 22. Then she calls her husband and says, "Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again." And he said, "Why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath." So it's not a time to celebrate. It's not a time to worship God, a new moon or a Sabbath, a Saturday. So why do you need him? He's not mocking her. He's just curious as to why she has to get to the man of God that day. And she says, "All is well. It will be fine if I can get to the man of God." She's focused on getting to him. Verse 24. Then she saddled the donkey and she said to her servant, "Urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you." So they had to travel. I don't know how far it was, but at least a day's journey from, if you look at Shunem to Mount Carmel on the map, it is not a short distance. Maybe 30, 40 miles. So she sets out and comes to the man of God at Mount Carmel. Now, we've seen Elisha a couple times at Mount Carmel, and we're not sure what he's doing there, other than maybe worshiping God, praying, studying. Um, You remember there's that altar that was rebuilt by Elijah. So there's this place. This is the second time we see Elisha going or at Mount Carmel. And when the man of God saw her coming, he says to Gehazi, his servant, look, there is the Shunammite. Run at once and meet her and say to her, is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child? Now, that third question, we know the answer, and that would be a hard question for her to answer. And she answers to them, all is well. She said the same thing to her husband. She doesn't really want to talk to her husband. She doesn't want to talk to Gehazi the servant. She wants to talk to the man of God. Why? Because she has faith that if he really is God's servant, then he is her only hope. Okay, so her faith is, I have to get to God's servant. This is up to verse 29. We read 27. Now, when she came to the mountain, to the man of God, she caught hold of his feet, and Gehazi came to push her away. But the man of God said, leave her alone, for she's in bitter distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me, has not told me. Sometimes the prophets get information ahead of time. Other times, like this, God doesn't tell Elisha ahead of time that she was coming or what's wrong. He waits for her to be able to talk in her own voice. Verse 28, she says, did I not ask my Lord for a son? He's saying, I didn't ask for this, but you promised. And did I not say, do not deceive me? So it seems deceptive to her that you promised me, and I said, don't deceive me. And you're like, no, you're going to have a son. And you gave me this son. God gave me this son. And then he takes him away. It sounds like God's deceiving. Now she's just in distress. In verse 29, he says to Gehazi, tie up your garment, take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet them. Him, and if anyone greets you, do not reply, and lay my staff on the face of the child. So don't talk to anybody along the way. There might be people that you see that know you, that want to have a conversation, want to have a meal, whatever. He says, you go. Okay, now this is a long day's journey, at least, to go back. So Gehazi goes out in front of, and Elisha thinks this is the solution. So she has to get to God's servant. She gets there. And now verse 30, then the mother of the child said, as the Lord lives, this is how godly, God-fearing people talk to each other. As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. Okay. Now, whenever she says that, she doesn't know that that's what Elisha said to Elijah a couple of times the day he so there was an urgency the day that Elijah was taken to heaven that Elisha had. Now this woman's exercising the same kind of urgency and saying, I know you're the man of God and I want to be with you. My hope is in your connection to the Almighty. Gehazi goes ahead as the servant, and now the woman and her servant and Elisha come along behind. So he arose and followed her, and Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff, like what Elisha said, laid the staff on the face of the child, and there was no sound or sign of life. Therefore he returned. So he goes ahead. I don't know if he's a half a day ahead or however far he's able to make better time. He returns to meet them and says, the child is not awakened. I went to the house. He knew where the house was. He goes there, does exactly what Elisha says, and it didn't work. Okay. So the great faith of the prophet realizes that God doesn't just use anyone. We're going to find out later in chapter 5 that Gehazi isn't the most upstanding character. He has some questionable greed and some ulterior motives. If God used Gehazi to raise this boy from the dead, it probably would have went to his head. Okay, it calls Gehazi here a young man or a young servant, so he's a younger man. And when Elijah was on earth, he didn't use Elisha to perform miracles either until Elijah was taken. And now, for whatever reason, and I'm speculating a little bit, but God is not going to use Gehazi. He's not going to just use anyone. And this is likely why the woman says, you are the servant of God. You have God's power. And I don't, not to say anything bad about Gehazi, but I don't trust him. Okay. Or I don't think he can actually perform the miracle. And he isn't able to. Okay. So the prophet realizes his faith is growing, that God just doesn't use anyone. And then verse 32. So Elisha comes to the house, and he saw the child lying dead on his bed. So he went in, shut the door behind the two of them, and praised to the Lord. And he went up. Now, how do you perform a resurrection? There aren't a lot of verses on how to perform resurrections. Okay. If you were Elisha, you'd be thinking, what did Elijah do? How did Elijah tell me that he was able to raise the widow's son back in 1 Kings 17? And you can look at 1 Kings 17, verse 21. Elijah is said to have stretched himself and prayed 3 times before that little boy was resurrected. So Elisha has that in mind. Okay. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't first. It wasn't Gehazi. I wasn't a servant. It was Elijah. And it wasn't like CPR. Like you can learn CPR to resuscitate someone. You can teach that to someone else. You can't teach resurrecting to someone. Okay. This is only God can do that. But if you have, like, you got this pressure on you as Elisha, like, how did Elijah do it? You can compare it to 1 Kings 17, and it sounds almost identical. Stretches himself on it, tries to give your body heat to the child, but it's not. He doesn't need body heat because anyone can give body heat. He needs God to help him. So all that Elisha does is just trying to probably remember what Elijah did and then trusting in God. And we clearly see him trusting in the Lord because he's praying the whole time, praying to the Lord. And we'll see at the end in a conclusion how this is private. It's just him and the boy. Verse 34. Then he went up and laid on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, his hands on his hands. And this sounds a little weird, but this sounds like he's doing CPR on him, but trying to get this little boy's body warm. And he stretched himself upon him. The flesh of the child became warm. Okay. So external heat, but we know that takes more from a head injury to revive than just it's going to require a miracle. Then he got up again and walked back and forth in the house and went up again and stretched himself upon him. And the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. If there was a brain injury of any kind, whether it was trauma or it was a brain aneurysm, this is not how you get healed. Okay. This is not natural. Elisha is not a doctor who's performing CPR. He is a prophet who is trusting in the Lord. And that's it. So his faith is growing in God. The longer God has Elisha wait, the more the anticipation is, and Elisha's faith is growing that I can't do whatever I'm doing is not the magic thing that's going to bring this boy back. It is God alone. It's just a matter of time. And so the child sneezes and he opens his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite. So Gehazi wasn't there observing this. And he called her. And when she came to him, he says, this is like, imagine the widow, imagine here, the widow of Nain, Lazarus' sisters, other resurrections. Okay. Imagine the joy on the Shunammite's house. You can't even imagine, right? The utter grief and distress she was in, confusion. Now it's pure joy. And she comes to him and he says, pick up your son. And she came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground, and she picked up her son and went out. This great faith required persistent faith, and it's rewarded with the resurrection. This is only the second resurrection in Scripture, all right? And this resurrection and the widow's son in 1 Kings 17 were both private. Why are these resurrections private? Well, if you think about this resurrection, there's one more at the death of Elisha. His bones are placed in a tomb, and the Moabites are coming over. We'll see that in 2 Kings 13. After Elisha dies, they throw this man's body quickly in a tomb. His body is dead. His body touches the bones of Elisha, and he wakes up. You're like, whoa, what just happened? Touched Elisha's bones, okay? And second resurrection that Elisha is kind of able to perform. He doesn't do anything other than his bones were touched. So But that was a private resurrection in a tomb. Jairus's daughter, how does Jesus, before he raises Jairus from the dead, he brings everybody outside and only the parents and only Peter, James, and John are there. Jesus, when he's resurrected, who sees him start to breathe again? No one. It's private. When Peter raises Dorcas from the dead in Acts 9, that's private as well. He puts everybody out. Why is it that so few people get to see resurrections? To build our faith without seeing. What does Jesus say to Thomas? You believed because you felt and you saw.
Yeah.
Blessed are those who never get to see me or any resurrection and yet believe. I don't know if Elisha heard. He wasn't probably following Elijah in 1 Kings 17. He wasn't there to observe that. All he heard about it. And so we, by faith, have to believe in the resurrection. One day. God's hand, as we heard this past Sunday, is on Elijah and Elisha. How do we know? Only God can perform resurrections. Only God can raise the dead.
Yeah.
And as we read, and other God-fearing people have read this story, your faith in God alone, being able to resurrect someone from the dead, should grow. The more you read it, you're like, only God can do this. This is God's hand. Okay? The Shunammite knew that. I have to stay with Elisha because Elisha is God's man and God's man has God's hand. Okay? And God is required for this resurrection. She knew that and she exercised faith. Elisha knew that. He had to persist in his faith. His faith grew. God's hand is the only explanation of connecting the wealthy with the needy prophet, and then providing a barren couple with a child, and then resurrecting that child from the dead. So trust God, trust his word, and obey him. He truly is the true and living God.